Today we're continuing a series called Dangerous Prayers. We decided to have a series at the beginning of this year. Normally, when you preach at the first of the year, you start talking about goals and habits and things like that, which are great, and I hope to preach more about those kinds of things. But this year, I thought about what is the number one thing that we need in our lives. And so we started, actually, at the end of last year, we had one message to prep us for the new year that said the most important thing you could have in your life is a relationship with God. And then we decided that, hey, the first three messages of this new year were going to be about the number one question that people ask me: how do I know what God's will is for my life? How could I really hear from God? So many people talk about, hey, I would like to hear from him, and I hear people say they heard from God, but how does that really work? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you for the first of this year 3 prayers that could change your life if you'll pray them. But the reason we call them dangerous is not because they're dangerous like you're going to get hurt, but they're dangerous like they're not things that you would normally pray. They're going to feel dangerous. They really will. In fact, you would say, ooh, that's not something that I would necessarily pray for. We started last week, and I'll give you an example of that, okay? So last Sunday we started with the first prayer, and it was a prayer from King David in the Psalms. In fact, one of the most important Psalms that there is. In fact, it said, have the best musicians sing this psalm, or song, honestly, from the book of Psalms. That was about this. He said, search me, God, right? How many people like that? How many people would you say, I would sign up for an audit if I could, right? Anybody? Nobody, right? And when we read the prayer, that's exactly what he's saying. Search me, reveal my fears, and uncover my sins, and lead me in the way of everlasting. And we're going, I don't know that I want to pray that, but by the time we finished, we went, if you can trust God, you could pray, God, search me, and point out these things that I need to change in my life. So if you missed that, newbranch.net's our website. Go back and listen, because it's very important that we pray that prayer. Today is equally dangerous, okay? It's equally counterintuitive, meaning we wouldn't naturally pray this way. And the prayer is this. I'm just going to tell you what it is, and then I'm going to ask you to wait. Don't just respond and go, I'm just going to check out on this one. Because here's what I know. If you keep doing the same thing, you'll keep getting the same result. So if you really want to connect with God and you go, I really haven't heard, then this may be the one that's going to unlock it for you. This could be one of the biggest keystone messages of your life, if you'll let it. Not message from me, but message from God. And the prayer is this: God, break me. I don't think I would have ever thought to do that, right? I do need to explain what I mean and what I don't mean. I don't mean that God needs your permission to break you. Some of us understand because maybe you've been broken to a million pieces. What I mean to say is this: how will you respond to God when you're broken? This will make you or break you. It will bless you or curse you. And today we're going to discover a dangerous prayer that could change our lives. There's 2 stories in the Bible that I want to draw off of that I believe are connected, and I never really saw it before, and I've been listening to a pastor, and it really helped me to realize that these 2 stories are connected. Before we get into them, though, I want to tell you something that happened to me before I started into ministry. About 25 years ago, I started attending a church called Western Branch Community Church, where I had been away from God. And I kind of came back to faith there, and Pastor Jim Wall there, he affirmed a gifting in me to say, I really believe God is calling you to pastor and to plant a church. And so I started meeting with him, and for about 3 years, I met with him, and I learned all kinds of things. And during that time, I started listening to another pastor that I'd heard before. I didn't know him personally, but I just was listening to him. And there was something that he said that really I just didn't understand. But he said it over and over and over again. The pastor's name was Chuck Swindoll, and what he said was this. He said, God has never used anyone that he hasn't crushed first. And I thought, I don't think I want to teach that, okay? First of all, I don't want to experience that, right? I don't want to be crushed. Why would I want that? And then the other thing, he would quote another theologian that is really awesome, and I've read a lot of his works, A.W. Tozer, who said this: it is doubtful that God could really bless anyone that he hasn't hurt deeply first. That just seems so weird, right? Anybody want to sign up for that? God break me, God crush me, God hurt me. Okay. No, I don't want that, right? How does that work? And what I want to do today is simply this. I want to show you why this is so important to pray, God break me. Because I understand this is counterintuitive. I understand that's probably not on the top of your prayer list. But here's what I want to tell you. If you want real life change, this is the prayer, man. If you want God's power, this is where it's found. And if you will open your mind to this, I have a feeling God might do a work in you that you've never had before, and he'll show up in your life in an amazing way that you've never thought you could ever experience, okay? So I want to share with you 2 stories from the Bible that I believe are connected. I never really saw the connection as much as I have now. It's found in the book of Mark, Mark chapter 14. Here's what the story says. Mark chapter 14 and verse 3, it says, while he was in Bethany, reclining at the table of the home of Simon the leper. Okay, let me explain who we're talking about. This is Jesus, and he's in somebody's home reclining, meaning he's kind of relaxing with a friend named Simon. Now, you have to understand, this week for Jesus was one of the busiest weeks of his whole life. He had started his earthly ministry. We know at Christmas time we celebrate he was born. And then around 30 years old, Jesus started his ministry, understanding himself that eventually he would die on the cross for the sins of the world and then rise from the dead. His followers did not really understand it. So at age 30, he selected disciples and he started to tell them that and started to teach them, what is it going to be like when I leave? And they didn't really know what he was talking about. He taught them how to live. He taught them all kinds of things. We're not ready for that one yet. So he taught them all kinds of things, but they were not ready yet to understand about his crucifixion. And we fast forward through time. After 3.5 years of ministry, Jesus knew at the end of this week that we're talking about here, he was going to die on the cross. And so, but what they were doing was this. It was called Passover week for them, which was a very important Jewish holiday. And so it's kind of like for us, we don't think of it that way because we're not in their culture. But for them, it's like 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and Christmas all wrapped up into one big holiday. It's where they celebrate being released from Egypt as slaves, and that God miraculously did these miracles to get them out of Egypt. And every year they celebrate a Passover, and it's a whole week of celebration. There's all kinds of things to do with it. And it ends with a meal called the Passover meal or the Seder meal, where each piece of it depicts something that has to do with the Passover. Everything represents that. For us, we can kind of understand in our culture where it's like, hey, if you go at Christmas time to your grandma's house or your mom's house, there's things that if you eat that food, it reminds you of that. Anybody? And that's kind of what this meal was all about for them. This season was all about for them. And it was very busy. And when Jesus came this time, everybody in Jerusalem welcomed him, saying, you might be Messiah. Now, at the end of the week, they're going to change their mind and want to crucify him. But at the beginning of the week, they were kind of like, oh, you might be Messiah. You're healing people. Your teachings are amazing. And so he was going through, and it was just a very busy week. And as he's reclining at this guy's house, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. And she broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Now, I don't know about you, but that's weird, right? Anybody? He's reclining at a person's house. He's trying to take a break. And this lady comes in, who he knows, takes an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. When we say very expensive, I mean the perfume was worth 1 year's wages. Think about that for a second. And she breaks it over him in front of everybody. It's weird, right? I mean, like, wouldn't that be weird today if somebody just randomly, I was sitting up front talking to somebody, and somebody comes over and they just pour an entire bottle of perfume on my head? I'm like, what in the world? Now, the perfume part wasn't as unusual in their day. The amount that she poured was super unusual, and it confused every single person in the room except Jesus. Everybody in the room went, what is happening, right? I mean, like, because if you saw that, you'd be like, first off, why are you interrupting Jesus? He's very busy. You shouldn't even be touching him. And if you knew what kind of person this lady was, you would say, she shouldn't even be in the same room as Jesus. That's what they're thinking. That was the first thing that offended them. Second, they were offended because of what she poured on him. It was like, why would you use such an extravagant gift for him? Why would you do that? Why would you break this thing and pour it out on Jesus and seemingly waste it? You could have just put a couple drops on him and that would have been good. But instead, you poured all of it on him. We're talking about, think about it this way. If I were to come up here and had something that was worth $100,000, think about that, and I just poured the whole thing, you'd be like, what did you just do? And that's what they all said. They were all, humanly speaking, they were appalled. They were like, you could have fed the poor at least for the whole year. Why did you waste this gift? And Jesus explains why it's important. In order to understand it, you have to understand who she was. In every gospel account, it tells this story. It's believed that this lady was a sinful woman. That's what they called her. It's believed that she probably had a career before knowing Jesus that was pretty horrible. She was a prostitute. That's what it's believed. And one of the reasons why they believe that, and believe me, there's all kinds of controversy as you put the passages together. Was it the same person? Was it not the same person in each gospel account? You can agree with me or you can just be wrong. No, I'm just playing. No, I mean, there's room for interpretation. I understand that. But here's what I want to tell you. It's believed that she was probably that person, that she probably was a prostitute in her life. Why? Because only most of the people in their society who owned this type of perfume were prostitutes. Not that it was a bad smell, like, ooh, that's a prostitute smell. No, it was because of the expense. It was like a tool of the trade. Like, in other words, if you went to an auto mechanic today, and we got some in here, you would know if you went and you saw they had a certain air-powered tool that cost a whole bunch of money, you'd be like, that's probably an auto mechanic, right? Because they own their own tools. But an average person wouldn't just have that sitting in their toolbox. An average lady in Jerusalem wouldn't be having this perfume because they couldn't afford $100,000 worth of perfume. You understand what I'm saying? But now, a prostitute did. Why? Because when they put that on and you walk by somebody and they smelled that, one, it turned their head like, ooh, that smells good, right? Two, they went, ooh, I know what she's about, right? You don't even have to tell me. I know who you are. I know what you're about. That's what that smell meant. And there's something about smell, this is really big, that brings you back to things. Anybody? Right? You smell things from your past that you haven't smelled in a long time, and it's funny how it takes you right back. More than anything else. More than sound, more than sight, but smell will take you back to whatever it is, good or bad. That smell takes her back. You understand what I'm saying? Huh. For me, it used to be carnations. I used to have that with carnations because, like, the first thing when I was a young child, I went to a funeral when I was younger, and every time I smell a carnation, it always makes me think of a funeral. I don't know why, but it's just that every time I do, right? And they're beautiful, but just I can't get that out of my head. But there's things that are like that, and this smell was the same for her. And you got to understand, when she came to Jesus, this lady had been a prostitute. You know what the word is used that you would think of for her is shame. Everywhere she goes, shame, right? I smell you, shame, right? I smell your perfume. I know you can afford a lot more than everybody else, but it's the way you can afford it. And everybody knows who you are. Everybody in the town knows who you are. The women hate you in the town. And the men, they don't love you. They just want to abuse you. I don't know what her background was. I can tell you as an ancient prostitute, it could not have been good, right? Whatever led her down that path had to be hideous. That's who she was. Her life was horrible until she met Jesus. When she met Jesus, it was the first time any man had ever shown her dignity and respect and love. As she came in that day, she broke. I want you to circle two words. She broke and she poured. You're going to see these words again. She broke and she poured. Everything she had. It represented her whole life, her past and her future. In fact, I want you to write that down. There's two things that I want you to write down. As we consider praying, God, break me. Two things. The first one is this. Her gift represented her past, her sinful life. The smell of it reminded her of it. That's her past. The second thing is this. Her gift represented her future. You have something that's worth a year's wages. What are you going to do with it? What will you do with it? What will your future be based on? Humanly speaking, it would have made more sense to sell it and use that money, right? Or maybe hold on to it just in case you need it. You see, what she did is like a fisherman that went, God has called me apart from fishing, and I decided to burn my boat. I'm never going back. That's what she did. She broke and she poured. She broke and she poured out her whole life. This is who I was. This is everything I was. And nobody else in the room gets it, but you know who did? Because everybody else, believe me, they were all appalled. In fact, Jesus' disciples were livid. They were like, how could you do that? And the one that was most livid was Judas Iscariot, who took care of the money. And you know, after that, that's when he decided to go betray Jesus because he couldn't believe it. How could you waste that? Big deal, right? You can read the account for yourself. But Jesus got it. And you know what he said at the end of it? He said at the end of this account, he said, everywhere the gospel is shared, her story will be shared. I'd say that's pretty important, isn't it? You know what's mentioned in every gospel account? That's important, right? All 4 books make a reference to this story because he said, not one time will the gospel be told that this lady's act will not be told. Why? Because she broke and she poured. This is big. He said in another place, she anointed me for my burial. He's comparing it to something. He's telling us something. I truly believe what he's showing us here is a prayer that says this: God, break me. God, break me. Give it all to me. Don't hold back. You see, what this lady was doing is she's going, my past no longer has a hold on me. I'm giving that to Jesus. I don't need to hold on to this thing that I might need because my hope is no longer in this thing. It's in Jesus. And she gave everything she had to him. The story that it's connected to is this. We skip down to the end of the book of Mark. You can read the rest of the account for yourself. It's an amazing day that Jesus had, but I want to come to where it comes to the end. And in Mark chapter 14 and verse 22, Jesus is meeting with his disciples for the Passover meal, like I just told you about. That it's kind of like a Christmas meal where they all come together and they all understood what it represented. But before they came in, I want you to see something, that these stories are linked. He's trying to show them something, and if you'll link these together, you'll suddenly see something maybe you've never seen, just like I never saw it before either. What you'll see is this, is that as they come into the room for Passover meal, Jesus does something he'd never done before. He gets down on his hands and his feet, and he washes their feet, and he pours water over their feet. And when he gets to the end of that, they're all kind of like, why did you do that? Not that people didn't wash their feet back then because they wore flip-flops in the desert. Imagine that. They're nasty feet, right? So you're like, okay, it's not unusual, but we usually have a servant do that, not the Lord, right? Not the Messiah. And he said, now that your Lord and Master has done this, you'll be blessed if you do the same for others. Do the same thing I did, right? Do the same thing I did. What? Pour, right? Pour. Same thought process. And then they go from that to the meal. And it says, while they were eating, he took the bread. So understand, they're sitting there with this Seder meal. Each piece represents something about the Passover, and he just takes 2 pieces of the meal. And what he does is this. It says, while they were still eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. You want to circle that? Broke it. That's the same word, isn't it? Broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, take it, this is my body. Verse 23. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. Verse 24. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out. You want to circle the word poured? For many, he said to them. So he's saying, hey, they don't understand it, so it's kind of like, hey, you're eating my body and drinking my blood, and it was confusing to them. But he was explaining to them what it was going to be like, and they remembered later to say, it's like my body is being broken on the cross for you, and my blood's being poured out for you. Do you see the 2 words? Broken and poured out. You starting to see the stories are connected? What did the lady do? She broke and she poured. Everything she had, she broke and she poured. What did Jesus do? He was broken and poured. He didn't hold back anything. The 2 are linked. The 2 are very linked. It says it this way in the book of Luke. It's the same story, but just from a different perspective. Luke writes it in the Gospel of Luke. He writes, and he took the bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Now, I've always taught and I've always thought, and I think it's still true, that as we gather together, and we did this at Christmas time on our Christmas Eve service, we all gathered together and we took the Lord's Supper together and we passed around it and we say, remember that Jesus Christ died for us, his broken body and his shed blood. I still believe that with all my heart. Don't take anything away from that. That none of the rest of it works without having what God does, that God will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, that he's the only one that can truly forgive us because he was broken and poured out for us. But then he says this, now you do the same thing. Maybe you never thought of the Lord's Supper that way. That it's not just about taking the meal and remembering him, it's about doing what he did. Just like he said all night long, this lady will be remembered for what she did. That was the first one. The second one was, hey, when I washed your feet, do the same thing I did and you'll be blessed. And he's saying this, I need you to be broken and poured. What? Why? Because God can't use anybody that he hasn't crushed first. That's what he's saying. I'll be broken for you, but the only way I will come alive in your life, it doesn't mean that he won't save you without you being broken. It means that you won't really have the power of God until you are. And I won't explain what I mean. I'm going to show you some other stuff, but I want you to think about that. I want you to have that. I want you to wrestle with it the same way I am, because I got a feeling it may just be what's missing in your life. We pray, God, break me. Now, why would I pray that? I'm going to give you some examples of some people in the Bible that this exact same thing happened to, just so you don't think that I'm just putting some pieces together that are not there. You see, I believe that the most effective ministry comes from our deepest hurts, that God wants to use them in incredible ways. But just like Chuck Swindoll said, God never uses anyone until he crushes them first. And there's a reason for that, and I want to explain it. I'll go back all the way to the book of Genesis. Just one example. There's many, but I'll use this guy as an example. In the book of Genesis, at the very end, there's a man by the name of Joseph. And before he was a man, when he was born to a man by the name of Jacob, who was, his grandfather was Abraham. So it was Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. And Jacob's name was later changed to Israel. Imagine that. So he's the father of the Israeli nation. And his son, his name was Joseph. He had other sons as well. And when Joseph was young, God gave Joseph a dream that said, everybody will bow down to you. You will be in charge of everything, and you will bless the entire world. Unfortunately, he was a teenager, and he told his brothers that. It was his father, needless to say, they kind of had a blended family, and they weren't biological, they didn't have the same mother. And so the brothers were livid. They were like, how could you say that? You're just so offensive. And so they decided, instead of killing their brother, they sold him into slavery. If you read it in the book of Genesis, it's an amazing account where he went from being in Israel's house, right, in Jacob's home, to being a slave in Egypt. And Egypt was the Mecca of the world. And so he got there, and when he gets there, he ends up in this person's house that's very rich and powerful, and this guy sees, and Joseph is blessed by God, and so he rises up, and the guy puts the whole house in charge of him. So it's like, hey, this is not looking so bad being a slave as like the pool boy kind of thing, you know? But unfortunately, the guy's wife was, the rich man's wife in Egypt his wife was a cougar, okay, if you know what that term means. Not kidding. I mean, you might want to read the Bible after this because you can't believe this is true, but it's true. And she puts the moves on him and says, I want you to sleep with me. And when he denies her, she falsely accuses him of sexually abusing her. Needless to say, the man's not very happy. And the slave has absolutely zero rights. And they throw him in the deepest, darkest dungeon in Egypt. Did you know that? And he spends nearly 2 decades of his life as a slave and in prison. Forgotten, seemingly forgotten by God. And then He's able to interpret a dream from Pharaoh, who's in charge of the whole world at that point. And basically what it is, hey, God's going to send a famine, and he wants to get you ready for it. And so Pharaoh says, hey, you're so smart, I'll put you in charge of all of it, and now you'll be second in command only to Pharaoh. You'll be the second in command in the entire world. You'll decide who eats and who doesn't eat. You will be the most powerful person in the world. Here's what I want to show you. Between the time that Joseph had a dream and the time that God made him in charge of the whole world, there was a space where God crushed him. What's the space for? You ever thought about that? How come he couldn't just do it right then? Because God never uses anyone he hasn't crushed first. Can I say it again? I'll give you another example. If you flip to the next chapter, then you'll go from Joseph to the book of Exodus. So from Genesis to Exodus, right? From Joseph to Moses. And Moses is born, now that they've been in Egypt for 400 years, the Egyptians decided, hey, we'll take them as slaves. Okay, they forgot about Joseph, and now they're slaves in Egypt. And so God says, hey, I'll send a deliverer to get you out of there and bring you back to the promised land. And so he rises a leader up, picked from birth, named Moses. And for 40 years, God does an amazing thing where through miraculous events, Moses is actually raised in Pharaoh's household. He has all the benefits of leadership and everything else. In history, we learn that Moses was a great general in Pharaoh's army, that he was an amazing leader. And at age 40, he decided, hey, I think I'll rise up, and maybe I'm the deliverer, and I will lead my people from here. And he kills an Egyptian guard. You can read about it in Exodus, thinking they'll probably rise up with me. Well, they didn't. They all turned their back on him, including his own people. And then Pharaoh wants to kill him. And so he decides, hey, it's time to get out of here. And so he flees as fast as he can go, all the way on the backside of a desert in the middle of nowhere, to a town that if you went there, you wouldn't know you had ever been there, to a little place in the middle of nowhere called Midian. Somebody thought I was going to say Zuni, but we don't have time. We haven't got time for Zuni jokes today. But anyway, there you go. To Midian. And for 40 years, Moses is a shepherd. And his dream of being the leader dies. That's what a fact. Between the time that God said, hey, you're going to be the leader, to the time of the burning bush where God calls him to be leader, Moses is 80 years old. 40 years in obscurity. What is that about? Can I say it again? God never uses anyone that he hasn't crushed first. You starting to see the picture? If I fast forward a little bit, after they get back to the promised land under Moses, in the book of 2 Samuel, Israel asked for a king, and so God gives them an incredible king. His name was Saul, and he was actually a good man when he started, and then he got away from God. And so God said, I'm going to remove the kingdom from you because you've sinned against me, and I'm going to give it to someone else. And the person he decides to give it to is named David, and he's just a shepherd boy at the time. He's just a teenage boy. And the prophet Samuel comes, in the book of 2 Samuel, you can read this. He comes, and he anoints David with oil, meaning that you're going to be the king, at about a young teenage boy. And he thinks, that's pretty awesome. And then in the next event that you see in the life of David, no one else knows that he's been anointed king because there's a king that sits on the throne, okay? But David goes out to the battlefield, and his brothers are there, and there's a big warrior that's fighting with them, and the power of God comes on him, and David is able to kill a giant named Goliath. And after he kills him, he launches himself into superstardom. This guy is an amazing warrior, and everybody in Israel loves him, except for the current king, who runs him out of Israel. And David leaves Israel and spends nearly 2 decades outside of Israel. He doesn't even live in Israel anymore. He lives in a cave in the hills of Adullam. Maybe you never read that. You know what his job was? He was a mercenary for the Philistines. Do you know who they are? They're the ones that Goliath worked for. How low can you get, right? So between the time that God anointed him king and the time he became king was almost 20 years. What was that about? Can I tell you again? God never uses anyone that he hasn't broken first, that he hasn't crushed first. We'll fast forward to the New Testament. There's many other stories I could use. But Jesus' disciples, in fact, one of the guys that was in the room that night, his name was Peter. He was the oldest apostle that Jesus had. I relate to him more than anyone else. He was very impulsive. He was a verbal processor. That's why I relate to him. because he would talk his way through whatever it was that he was doing. So oftentimes that didn't work out very good because it's like with Peter, it was like he was already ahead of where he should be, and sometimes what he said was really great, and then other times what he said was really stupid, okay? And he said a lot of things that were really dumb. And in the same sentence, Jesus would say, hey, you're the rock, and change his name. And then in the same sentence, Jesus changed it and said, get behind me, Satan. This is the kind of guy he was, right? Because he was impulsive. He was the first one to do everything. He was the first one to jump out and do everything. He was a good guy. He really was. My brother loves him because he was a fisherman. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. Peter, in the Gospels, you can read about him. He spends 3.5 years with Jesus. And on this same night that we're looking at here on the screen, during this meal, Jesus comes to Peter and he says, tonight you're going to deny me. Tonight things are going to go bad. And when they go bad, you won't stay by me. You'll deny me. And Peter said, oh no, I'll never do that. In fact, I'll fight to the death for you. And when the guards come to get Jesus, when everything changes from Jesus being popular to now they're going to arrest him, Peter does exactly what he said. He pulls out his sword and he strikes the guard. In fact, I think he meant to hit his head, but he's probably like some of us that are starting to get where it's like you're reading and you're like, right? So adrenaline is pumping a little bit, and he pulls out his dagger, and instead of hitting the guy in the head, he hits his ear and knocks the guy's ear off. I need bifocals. You know what I mean? Like, dude, you might need bifocals now. You know, you missed the whole head. Okay, anyway. Sorry. Things I think about. Jesus takes the ear of the guard and puts it back on. That's not what we're here for. And at that point, Peter understood. You're not looking to be rescued. You're looking to die, like a martyr's death. I don't want to do that. I've seen what the Romans can do. And he fled. He was afraid. And fear entered his life, and darkness entered his life. And every time somebody asked if they knew him, he kept denying Jesus until finally the cock crowed, which really means a certain time period. And Jesus said, when the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. And he died inside. You'll see he went back to fishing after it. When Jesus died and Jesus rose from the dead, you don't see Peter close to Jesus. You can read about it for yourself at the end of the Gospels. Not until he's out there fishing and Jesus comes on the shore side. He recognizes him and he comes out. The rest of the people get there first. And then finally Jesus spends a moment alone with Peter on a beach. It's one of the most beautiful scenes in all the Bible. And Jesus forgives Peter. Not only does he forgive him, you see, Peter was broken. Up till then, every time there was anything, Peter thought, hey, I can do it in my own strength. I will jump out and do it. I will jump out and do it. Can I tell you today? God never uses anyone that he hasn't broken first. And he says something to Peter that takes Peter completely off guard. I denied you, Lord. And he says, I'm going to put you in charge of the church. You read about it. Me? You can't mean me, right? And like I said, God hasn't used anyone that he hasn't crushed first. And on the day of Pentecost, on the day that the church starts, you see, when Jesus left, he said, I want you to go and share the gospel with every living creature, but first, I want you to wait. You know what Peter's never done a day in his life? Wait. And you know what he does when you read the book of Acts 1 and Acts 2? He waits for 10 days. He doesn't go out and preach. He waits for the power of God. And when the Holy Spirit of God fills him with power, what happens? He preaches. He starts the church. That's why I say he leads it. He preaches the first message of the church, and 3,000 people get saved and baptized that day. Acts chapter 2. It's an amazing account. Can I tell you why? Because God's never used anybody he hasn't crushed first. The Apostle Paul, probably the greatest apostle that there is. Oh, he's not one of the 12. If you have to read about him in the book of Acts, because he wasn't there with Jesus as one of the 12 disciples. He was actually on the other side. See, he was probably there. He was one of the Pharisees that Jesus was talking to. You know, the Pharisees, the religious rulers of the day, the ones that didn't believe in him. And Jesus constantly said stuff to them like, hey, you know, you're like a whitewashed coffin. That's what you're like. You yourself will never enter the kingdom of God, and you won't let anybody else either. And Peter, and the Apostle Paul wanted to stamp out Christianity completely, and so he became a fanatic, and he would kill Christians and kill their children and kill their wives and kill their kids to cause them to recant their faith, and they wouldn't. And not until Jesus appeared to him on a road, right? That he changed Peter's life, changed the Apostle Paul's life. And when he changed his life, what happened? He wanted to become an apostle. And immediately, he went to Jerusalem. And you know what? They didn't accept him. This is a part of the story nobody hears. And the Apostle Paul lived about 10 years in obscurity. From the time he was called to be an apostle to the time that he started being an apostle was about 10 years. Why? Can I tell you again? God never uses anybody he hasn't crushed first. Now, you read about it, you'll see that it wasn't until Barnabas came and went and found him and brought him back, and they used him to reach the Gentiles. It's amazing. Where was he all that time? God was doing a work. You see, that's what I believe that he wants to do in us. As we pray, God, break me. God, break me. I don't want to get too personal today, but because I brought it up, God showed me that in my life. Because I always wondered, when I heard Chuck Swindoll say it, I thought to myself, I don't think I want to sign up for that. Right? And I told you, I went to Pastor Jim when I was 22 years old, and he said, hey, I'll mentor you, and he did for several years, and then we went and served at another church for a period of time, and for about 5 years, things were going really well until me and my wife's life just pretty much fell apart. I still wanted to pastor, but our finances were crushed. I wanted to pastor, but my wife's health and mental state was crushed. In fact, when I went to the doctors, they were saying, you need to start thinking about how you're going to plan your life for when she's not here anymore. It's like, I didn't sign up for that, you know? I mean, like, that's not, you were supposed to bless our lives, that's not the path that we were supposed to go down. You wanted me to plant a church, how am I supposed to do that? And for almost 10 years, we spent not being able to be involved, not being able to do things. She couldn't come to church. She would have panic attacks and literally couldn't come. God crushed me. And while I was being crushed, every dream that I had died, which was probably a good thing, because the church I had envisioned is nothing like the church that we have. It was all about big and numbers. You might wonder why I always say that, like we're not about numbers. Because God crushed that in me. I saw a different side of it, where some men came alongside me and they showed me a different path, not just the showy pieces of church, not just the showy pieces of God, but how could you really be in relationship with other people? How could you be going through the darkest time and somebody walk through that with you? Do you wonder why that's our vision? Somebody's disconnected and all alone. That's the vision that God birthed in us. And then over time, my wife started getting better. We were able to live on our own again. We lived with my in-laws for nearly 6 years. And we were able to move out, and God started to work in our lives again. And I went back to Pastor Jim, and he helped me with starting what we were going to do here. And as I look out at this crowd today, you know what I see? I see a lot of people that are just like me. I could tell you stories of their stories that are 10 times the story that I have. It's not about comparing, but just so you know. But what I know is this, is that God can never use anybody he hasn't crushed first. That the most effective ministry you'll ever have doesn't come from your strength. It will come from your weakness. It will come from where God has crushed you. Your deepest hurts will become your greatest ministry. I'm telling you that today because here's the thing. It isn't if God will crush you. It's how you respond to the crushing. It isn't if God will break you, because you will be broken. I remember I read a book during that time by an author named Corrie ten Boom. It's always better to read about somebody that's going through 100 times worse situation than you are, so you can say, well, at least I'm not you. You know? And the book was called The Hiding Place. And I remember just one part of it I wanted to share with you today, and that is, she said at the end of it, she had been in a concentration camp, and she was released, and she did public tours. And she would always say to people, she said, hold everything in your life loosely. Because if you don't, it's going to hurt when God has to pry it out of your hands. Here's my question. Would you pray, God, break me? Or are you holding on to it? You see, the reason why I held on to it so long, I'll tell you what mine was. Mine was rage and anger and bitterness and hate. I held on to it. You can't have it. You can have everything else, but you're never going to have this. You can't make me. God won't make you. But the question is do you trust him enough? You see, he's not asking you to do anything that he didn't do himself. Broken and poured. Oh, he went first. See? His body was broken and his blood was shed, and he poured his whole self out for you and took all of the hell onto himself. And what he's asking is, have I done enough for you to trust me that you can empty you? See? That's what breaking is all about. He's breaking you, so why? So he can fill you. You can't fill a full vessel, you know. When I'm full of hate, he can't have my heart. You get it? You starting to see it? God, break me. Here's where I think it starts today. Here's my challenge for you today anyway. In a moment, I want to pray with you, but here's the way I'd like us to pray today, and God, break me. Not just everything, although that might be somebody. Not just generic, but what is the one thing that you're holding on to that you've never given God? Do you trust him with it? Has he done enough for you to trust him with whatever that is in your hand? You know what I'm talking about? Just like this lady, right? I could hold on to my past just in case I got to go there. I could have held on to this in case I need it in the future. What are you holding on to? I know for me and Marie, one of the big things that God broke in us was our finances, where he would say, you know, John, you trust in your credit cards, not me. I remember the day that we cut them up. That was a breaking, you know. It was a little easier because they actually were going to cut them all off anyway, but but why do you have to wait till then, right? I remember Dave Ramsey saying, if you want to live like no one else, you got to live like no one else. Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? Maybe it's time that you stop holding on to that and start holding on to God and his way of doing it. Maybe it's like me. Maybe you're holding on to rage or resentment or bitterness. I don't know. Maybe, if I could get specific just for a minute, maybe it's a toxic relationship that you know you need to have a hard conversation about. You just keep thinking, yeah, I know that it doesn't add up, but I'm just going to keep going down this path, and you know it's never going to get better, and you're feeding off of each other in a really, really bad way, and it's time to have the real dialogue and to give that to God. You're afraid to be alone. That's why you're doing it. Just being honest. Would you give it to God? Would you let go and let God? Oh, I said it wasn't going to be easy, right? But it could be the most life-changing thing you'll ever have. Maybe it's a number in your phone. You might not know what I mean, but somebody here, you're going to know exactly what I mean. There's something you're keeping on the side, a number in there that you need to delete. It's the past, isn't it? And every time you think you get traction, it pulls you back in. It may be a relationship, but it may be, trying to be careful how I say this, but I'm just going to say it. It may be a drug dealer. I've seen this 1,000 times. I just never got around to it, but you know it's there, don't you? And you keep that phone number, and in the right combination, what happens? You called that phone number again, don't you? You know what I think God's calling you to do today? Maybe today's the day you could delete that. Oh, I can't, right? You better believe, you try to do that, you better believe Satan will show up in a mighty way, right? But when you do, I bet it will unlock freedom in a way you cannot understand. Maybe it's not something you need to give up. Maybe it's something you need to do. You know, we have small groups that meet during the week. Maybe you go, I've just never taken that step. And you know you need it in your life, but you've just never done that. Maybe you just need to write it on your Connect card. I need to be around some people, right? Maybe it's an addiction that you need to break, and instead of it being a small group, maybe it needs to be a 12-step program. You know, we have an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that meets right here on Friday night. They're not affiliated with us because Alcoholics Anonymous is not affiliated with anyone. But maybe that's where you need to be. Because until you get your sobriety, you're going to try and do everything else, and it keeps coming back to this because you got to let yourself be broken. God, break me, right? I surrender. Sometimes we surrender and God takes it immediately, right? Sometimes we surrender and God takes us through a process. You let him decide, right? He'll decide what defects of character he removes right away. But maybe you got to pray, God, break me. So here's what I want to do. I just simply want us to pray today. And if you feel encouraged to do this, then I want you to do it. So here's what I want to do. Let's just pray together. We don't want to stand. Let's not stand. Let's just sit just for a minute. What's God saying to you? If you want, you can close your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable with that, that's okay. But maybe while you're praying today, if you got something, maybe just hold it in your hand just like a fist. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe that's you. And maybe that thing that God puts in your mind, just hold on to it as tight as you can. And when the time is right, maybe today is the day that you pray, God, break me. And when you say break me, just open your hand to God. You go, well, that's silly, John. That won't do anything. Believe me. I know because I did. So I'm asking you today, would you give that to God today? I'm going to give you a minute. So, Father, I'm just praying in this place today. Lord, something I never thought I would ever pray in my life. Lord, break me. Don't let me hold on to these things. And I can pray it because I trust you, Lord. You were broken and poured out. And the only way I can be filled by you is when I allow myself to be poured out so that you can be poured in. I'm praying that for somebody today. Whatever they've been holding on to, they can't see their way clear, but they can't seem to let go. I got a feeling, Lord, they're like me. They're trying to control everything. And in a world full of chaos, it's the stupidest thing, Lord. We're trying to control it all. We think we can control it, and we can't. And we're so mad, and we're so angry, and we're so hurt, and we're so guilty. I'm just praying today, God, maybe right now they just let it go to you. And go, I don't need a plan. What I need is Jesus. I need a relationship with God because I don't even know what to do. I pray they give it to you today, God. And when they do, I believe that you're going to take their hurt and you'll never waste a hurt. You'll bring them closer to you. As they give that to you, Lord, you'll bring them closer to you than they've ever been in their life. That's what I'm praying all over this place. Maybe it's really the first step today, God. That somebody's here today and they go, you know what I got to do? I just got to open my life to God. That Jesus died on the cross and he rose from the dead, and I'm just going to invite God into my life today. God, I pray for all of us. God, break us. We'll give you all the honor and glory and praise in Jesus' name. Amen.